There are moments in life when heaven goes silent. Not because God has left you, but because he is watching you walk through a fire that only the chosen can endure. May 10th, 2026 is not just a date. It is a declaration, a line drawn between who you were and who you have become. A quiet, sacred announcement in the spirit. Congratulations, it's all over. But not everyone will understand what over truly means. Because what ended was not just a struggle. It was a season of shaping. It was the breaking of pride, the crushing of comfort, the stripping away of everything that made you depend on anything other than God. You thought you were losing people, losing opportunities, losing pieces of yourself, but heaven saw it differently. Heaven called it preparation. This is a calling few understand. There were nights when your prayers felt like they hit the ceiling and fell back down in silence. Days when you smiled in public, but bled in private. You questioned your purpose, your direction, even your faith. You asked God, "Why me?" without realizing that the very weight you were carrying was proof that you were trusted with something greater than ordinary. Because ordinary people don't walk through extraordinary trials. You were being set apart. God was removing distractions, detaching you from places and people that could not go where he is taking you. And it hurt. It felt like abandonment. It felt like punishment. But it was actually protection. Because the calling on your life demands a different level of refinement, a deeper surrender, a stronger spirit. And now, something has shifted. You may not see fireworks. You may not hear thunder. But deep within your spirit, there is a quiet knowing something has ended. The confusion is over. The delay is over. The version of you that doubted your worth is over. You didn't just survive, you transformed. This is where many misunderstand the journey of faith. They think the victory is loud, visible, celebrated by everyone. But the greatest victories in the kingdom are often silent. They happen within, in the heart, in the spirit, where God whispers, "Well done, you didn't quit." Because quitting would have been easy. Walking away would have been understandable. But you stayed. You held on when your hands were tired. You believed when your faith was barely a flicker. You kept showing up even when nothing made sense. And that kind of endurance is not natural. It is supernatural. It is evidence of a calling that few can carry. You are not who you used to be, and you cannot go back. Because once God opens your eyes, once he reveals your purpose, once he walks you through the valley and shows you that even there, he is with you, you are changed forever. The things that used to satisfy, you no longer do. The places that once felt comfortable now feel too small. The conversations that once entertained you now feel empty. This is the cost of calling. It separates you, but also elevates you. And now, as this chapter closes, you must understand something critical. This is not the end of your journey. It is the end of your preparation. What comes next requires the version of you that was forged in the fire. The strength you didn't know you had. The faith you didn't know could survive. The resilience that only comes from walking with God when no one else understands. This is where your purpose begins to unfold. Not in comfort, but in calling. Not in ease, but in obedience. Because God is not just interested in blessing you. He is interested in using you. There are lives you are meant to touch. Hearts you are meant to heal. Paths you are meant to walk that others are too afraid to take. And the reason you went through what you went through is because someone, somewhere, will need your story to survive their storm. So today is not just about closure. It is about commission. Heaven is not just saying, "It's over." Heaven is saying, "Now go." Go with the strength you earned in silence. Go with the faith that refused to die. Go with the understanding that you were never alone, even when it felt like it. This is your moment. Not because everything is perfect, but because you have been prepared. And as you step forward, remember this. The calling on your life will not always make sense to others. Some will misunderstand you. Some will question you. Some will walk away because they cannot see what God has placed inside you. But you were never called to be understood. You were called to be obedient. And obedience will take you places that comfort never could. So stand firm. Walk boldly. And when the world asks how you made it through, you won't need a long explanation. Your life will speak for itself. Because on May 10th, 2026, something ended, and something far greater began. There are seasons in life when everything familiar begins to fall apart. Not with noise, not with warning, but with a quiet, unsettling shift that only your spirit can feel. It does not announce itself loudly, and it does not seek your permission. It simply arrives, and suddenly the things that once gave you certainty begin to feel distant, fragile, and temporary. In this place, you're not surrounded by applause or encouragement. You are surrounded by silence. A silence so deep that it forces you to confront yourself, your faith, and your dependence on God in ways you never have before. This is not an ordinary silence. This is a refining silence. This is where the fire begins, even when you cannot see the flames. You may have wondered why everything had to become so still, why the voices faded, why the support lessened, why the doors you expected to open remained shut. It felt like isolation, like abandonment, like being forgotten. But what you did not realize is that God often removes the noise before he reveals his voice. Because as long as there are distractions, as long as there are alternatives, as long as there are other sources you can lean on, you will never fully understand what it means to depend on him completely. So he allows the silence, not to punish you, but to position you. And in that silence, the fire begins its work. This fire is not meant to destroy you. It is meant to reveal you. It burns away illusions, false identities, misplaced confidence, and hidden fears. It exposes the parts of you that were built on approval, comfort, and control. It forces you to face the truth about where you are. Faith really stands when everything else is stripped away. Because it is easy to say you trust God when life is stable. It is easy to believe when the path is clear. But when everything becomes uncertain, when you cannot see what is ahead, when nothing feels secure, that is when your faith is tested in its purest form. There were moments when you felt like you were losing yourself, like the version of you that you once understood was slipping away. And in a way it was, but it was never meant to remain. The fire was not taking something valuable from you. It was removing what could not survive where you're going. Because the calling on your life requires a different version of you. A version that is not easily shaken, not easily distracted, not easily defined by external circumstances. A version that has been tested, stretched, and strengthened in ways that cannot be explained to those who have never walked through this kind of fire. And yet, even in the middle of it, there were questions. Honest, heavy questions that rose from a place of deep exhaustion. Questions about purpose, about timing, about why the process had to be so intense, so isolating, so prolonged. You asked why it felt like progress was invisible, like your efforts were unnoticed, like your prayers were unanswered. You asked why God would allow you to feel so alone when you were trying so hard to stay faithful. But what felt like distance was actually discipline. What felt like absence was actually attention. Because God was not ignoring you. He was working on you in a way that required privacy, intensity, and precision. There is a kind of transformation that cannot happen in public. It requires hiddenness. It requires moments where no one else sees your struggle, your growth, your breaking points, or your quiet victories. It requires a space where your relationship with God is not influenced by expectations, comparisons, or distractions. And that is what this season created. A sacred space where everything between you and God became real, raw, and undeniable. You began to see things differently. Things that once seemed important started to lose their weight. Things that once consumed your attention no longer held the same power. You became more aware of what truly matters and more sensitive to what is not aligned with your purpose. And even though this awareness came with discomfort, it also came with clarity. A clarity that cannot be taught, only experienced. The fire has a way of changing your perspective. It reshapes your understanding of strength, of success, of faith. It teaches you that strength is not about having everything together, but about holding on when everything feels like it is falling apart. It teaches you that success is not measured by what others see, but by the growth that happens within. And it teaches you that faith is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to keep believing in the middle of it. There were times when you wanted relief more than anything. Times when you hoped for a quick escape, a sudden breakthrough, a clear sign that everything was about to change. But instead, the process continued, slowly, intentionally, without rushing. And while it felt frustrating, it was also necessary. Because if the process had ended too soon, the transformation would have been incomplete. If the fire had been extinguished too early, there would still be parts of you unrefined, unprepared, and unable to carry what is ahead. This kind of preparation is not for everyone. It is not comfortable, it is not easy, and it is not always understood. But it is purposeful. Every moment of discomfort, every moment of uncertainty, every moment of silence has been shaping something within you that cannot be created any other way. It has been building endurance, deepening your faith, strengthening your spirit, and aligning your heart with something greater than your own plans. And even though you may not fully understand everything that has happened, there is a quiet awareness within you that you are not the same, that something has shifted, that the way you think, the way you feel, the way you respond has been altered by this experience. You may not be able to explain it in words, but you can feel it in your spirit. A new level of awareness, a deeper sense of purpose, a stronger connection to God. This is what the silent fire does. It works beneath the surface, beyond what can be seen or easily explained. It transforms you from the inside out, preparing you for a calling that requires more than talent or desire. It requires depth. It requires resilience. It requires a faith that has been tested and proven in the most difficult conditions. And as difficult as it has been, as confusing as it has felt, as heavy as it has become at times, there is meaning in it. There is intention behind every moment. Because this was never about breaking you. It was about building you into someone who can carry what is coming next. There comes a point in the journey where the pain is no longer loud, but becomes deeper, quieter, and more personal. It is no longer about what is happening around you, but what is being removed from within you. This is the place where separation begins to take shape, not as a sudden event, but as a gradual unfolding. People you once felt connected to begin to feel distant. Conversations lose their meaning. Environments that once felt familiar start to feel heavy, almost as if your spirit no longer belongs there. And you cannot always explain it, which makes it even more difficult to carry. You try to hold on at first. You try to maintain what once was, to preserve relationships, to keep doors open, to stay connected to what used to give you comfort. But something within you resists, not out of pride, not out of arrogance, but out of alignment. Because when God begins to shift your direction, He also begins to shift your connections. And what once felt right begins to feel out of place, not because those things were wrong, but because they're no longer meant for where you're going. This is where surrender becomes unavoidable. Surrender is often misunderstood as weakness, as giving up, as losing control. But in reality, it is one of the strongest decisions you can make. Because surrender requires you to release what you cannot control and trust what you cannot see. It requires you to let go of your own understanding and accept that God's plan may not match your expectations. And that is not easy. It challenges your desires, your timelines, your need for certainty. There are moments when you try to negotiate with God, moments when you ask for clarity before obedience, for confirmation before movement, for assurance before letting go. You wanted to understand everything before you surrendered anything. But this process does not work that way. God does not reveal everything at once. He reveals just enough for you to take the next step. And that step requires trust, not full understanding. So little by little, things began to fall away. Not all at once, but in layers. Certain relationships faded without conflict. Opportunities that once seemed promising quietly disappeared. Plans you had carefully built started to unravel. And each time something left your life, it created a space. A space that initially felt like loss, like emptiness, like something important had been taken from you. But that space was not meant to remain empty. It was being cleared for something that had not yet arrived. And still, the process felt lonely. Because separation does not always come with explanation. People may not understand why you're changing, why you're stepping back, why you no longer engage the same way. Some may take it personally. Some may misunderstand your silence as distance, your growth as disconnection. And that creates an internal conflict because you care, but you also know that you cannot stay where you no longer belong. This is the tension of transformation. You're no longer who you were, but you're not yet fully who you are becoming. You are in between, in a place where clarity is partial and direction is still unfolding. And in this space, surrender is not a one-time decision. It is a continuous process, a daily choice to trust God even when your emotions are uncertain, even when your surroundings feel unfamiliar, even when your future is not fully visible. There were days when you questioned if you were making the right decisions, days when you wondered if you were walking away from something you should have fought for, or letting go too soon, or misinterpreting what you felt in your spirit. Doubt tried to creep in, not loudly, but subtly. It whispered questions, planted hesitation, created moments of second-guessing. But deep within you, there was still a quiet conviction that you could not ignore. That conviction did not come from logic. It came from alignment. It was a sense that even though things were difficult, even though you did not have all the answers, you were moving in the direction you were meant to go. And that sense became your anchor. Not your emotions, not your circumstances, not the opinions of others, but that inner knowing that God was leading you, even if the path was unclear. As surrender deepened, so did refinement. Refinement is not about perfection. It is about purification. It is about removing what is unnecessary, what is distracting, what is limiting your ability to fully step into your calling. And this process is not always comfortable. It exposes habits, thought patterns, and emotional responses that need to change. It reveals areas where growth is required, where healing is needed, where maturity must develop. You began to notice things about yourself that you had overlooked before, reactions that needed to be controlled, fears that needed to be confronted, attachments that needed to be released. And while this awareness was uncomfortable, it was also necessary, because you cannot carry certain things into the next season of your life. They would only hold you back, weigh you down, limit what you are capable of becoming. So the process continued, slowly, consistently, without rushing. You learned to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. You learned to listen more than you spoke. You learned to seek God not just in moments of need, but in moments of stillness. Your relationship with Him became less about asking for things and more about understanding His presence. Less about seeking answers and more about trusting His timing. And in that space, something began to change within you. You became less reactive and more intentional, less dependent on external validation and more grounded in your identity, less focused on controlling outcomes and more open to divine direction. These changes were not always visible to others, but they were deeply real to you. This is what refinement looks like. It is not loud. It is not always visible, but is powerful. It shapes your character, strengthens your discipline, deepens your faith. It prepares you not just to receive what is coming, but to sustain it. Because what God is preparing for you requires more than desire. It requires readiness. It requires a version of you that has been tested, stretched, and refined. And even though the process of separation and surrender felt like loss at times, it was never meant to diminish you. It was meant to align you, to bring you closer to who you are called to be, to remove what does not belong so that what does belong can fully take its place. You may not have understood every moment. You may not have agreed with every change, but each step has been part of something intentional, something designed to prepare you for a calling that demands depth, clarity, and unwavering trust. And as much as it required you to let go, it also required you to grow. There comes a moment in the journey where you begin to realize that the greatest battle was never outside of you, but within you. Not the people, not the circumstances, not the delays, but the internal version of yourself that was shaped by fear, doubt, insecurity, and past wounds. And as everything around you started to shift, there was an even deeper shift taking place inside, one that you could not ignore anymore. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but over time it became undeniable. You were not the same person, and the old version of you could no longer survive in the space you were being led into. This realization does not come easily, because the old self is familiar. It is comfortable. It is predictable. Even in its limitations, it feels safe because you understand it. You know how it reacts, how it thinks, how it protects itself. And letting go of that version of yourself feels like stepping into the unknown without a guarantee. It feels like losing control of an identity you spent years building, even if that identity was never fully aligned with who you were meant to be. There were parts of you that held on tightly, parts that resisted change, that questioned the need for transformation, that tried to convince you to go back to what was easier, what was known, what required less from you. These parts were not trying to harm you. They were trying to protect you in the only way they knew how. But protection rooted in fear can only take you so far. At some point, it becomes a limitation rather than a safeguard. And that is where the process becomes intense. Because the end of the old self is not a single decision. It is a series of moments where you are confronted with choices that challenge everything you have been used to. Moments where you must decide whether to respond the way you always have, or to step into a new way of thinking, a new way of being. And these choices are not always easy. They require awareness, discipline, and a willingness to do what feels uncomfortable in the moment. You start to notice the difference. Situations that once triggered immediate reactions now invited reflection. Emotions that once controlled your decisions now required understanding. Patterns that once felt automatic now became visible, almost as if you were seeing them from the outside for the first time. And with that awareness came responsibility. Because once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to acting unconsciously. You are now accountable for the way you respond, the way you think, the way you move forward. This is where the shift deepens. The old self begins to lose its influence, not all at once, but gradually. Its voice becomes quieter, its reactions less dominant, its control less absolute. And while this is growth, it can also feel disorienting, because you're no longer operating from the same place, but you're still learning how to fully step into the new version of yourself. There's a transition period where things feel unfamiliar, where your responses feel intentional rather than automatic, where your identity is being rebuilt from the inside out. There are moments of internal conflict, moments where the old instincts tried to resurface, where the familiar patterns called you back, where the easier path seemed more appealing. And in those moments, you had a choice. Not a loud, dramatic choice, but a quiet, consistent one. To either return to what you knew or to continue stepping into what you are becoming. And each time you chose growth over comfort, something shifted within you. Not always visibly, not always immediately, but deeply. You began to develop a different kind of strength. Not the kind that is loud or forceful, but the kind that is steady, grounded, and intentional. A strength that does not rely on external validation, but on internal alignment. A strength that allows you to remain calm in situations that once overwhelmed you, to stay focused when distractions arise, to move forward even when uncertainty is present. This strength did not come from avoiding challenges. It came from facing them, from choosing to respond differently, to think differently, to act differently even when it felt unnatural at first. And over time, what once felt unnatural began to feel like your new normal. The way you saw yourself began to change. The way you saw others began to change. The way you approached life began to shift in ways that you could not have imagined before. The end of the old self is not about losing who you are. It is about uncovering who you were always meant to be. It is about removing the layers that were shaped by experiences, expectations, and limitations that no longer serve you. It is about stepping into an identity that is not defined by your past, but by your purpose. And this process requires honesty. Deep, uncomfortable honesty with yourself about what needs to change, what needs to be released, what needs to be rebuilt. You had to let go of certain beliefs. Beliefs about your worth, your capabilities, your limitations. Beliefs that were formed in moments of failure, rejection, or fear. Beliefs that quietly influenced your decisions, your confidence, your willingness to take risks. And letting go of those beliefs was not just about thinking differently. It was about choosing to see yourself through a different lens. A lens that is not clouded by past experiences, but clarified by growth and purpose. You also had to release certain emotional attachments. Attachments to outcomes, to expectations, to the need for control. These attachments often created unnecessary pressure, leading to frustration when things did not go as planned. And as you learned to release them, you created space for flexibility, for trust, for a deeper sense of peace. Not because everything became predictable, but because you became more grounded regardless of what happened. And through all of this, your identity began to shift. Not in a superficial way, not in a way that others could easily label, but in a foundational way. The core of who you are began to align with something deeper, something more stable, something more authentic. You were no longer driven by the same fears, the same insecurities, the same need for external approval. You were becoming more centered, more intentional, more aware of your direction and your purpose. This is not a process that happens overnight. It takes time, consistency, and patience. It requires you to show up even when you do not feel like it, to choose growth even when it is difficult, to remain committed even when progress feels slow. And there will still be moments of challenge, moments where the old self tries to reappear, moments where doubt tries to creep in. But those moments no longer define you, because you have changed. And even if the transformation is still ongoing, even if there's still more growth ahead, the version of you that once was no longer has the same power, the same influence, the same control. Something has ended within you, not with noise, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a quiet certainty that you cannot go back to who you used to be. And even if you tried, it would no longer feel right. There is a moment after the breaking, after the refining, after the quiet internal transformation, where something shifts from preparation into purpose. It does not arrive with loud celebration or immediate recognition. It comes with a deep awareness that you are no longer being shaped for something. You are now being sent into something. The weight feels different. The responsibility feels real. The calling that once felt distant, almost abstract, now feels present, personal, and unavoidable. You begin to understand that everything you went through was not random. Every delay carried intention. Every moment of isolation carried direction. Every internal battle carried instruction. What once felt like disconnected struggles now forms a pattern, a design that only becomes visible when you step back and see how each piece contributed to who you are now. And with that realization comes a new kind of clarity, not about every detail of your future, but about your role within it. This is where many hesitate, because stepping into a calling is different from preparing for one. Preparation happens in private. It allows room for mistakes without exposure, for growth without pressure, for development without constant demand. But purpose moves into visibility. It requires action, consistency, and a willingness to be seen, not for attention, but for impact. And that can feel overwhelming. You may question whether you are truly ready, whether you have enough knowledge, enough strength, enough clarity to carry what is being placed in front of you. You may feel the weight of expectation, both from within and from what you assume others might see. And in those moments, it is important to understand that readiness is not about perfection. It is about alignment. It is about being willing to move forward with what you have, trusting that what you need will meet you along the way. Because the calling is not sustained by your own strength alone. It is sustained by your willingness to remain connected, to remain grounded, to remain aware of where your direction comes from. The same discipline that carried you through the silent seasons now becomes the foundation for how you move forward. The same awareness that helped you navigate internal change now becomes the guide for external action. You begin to move differently, not out of urgency, not out of pressure, but out of intention. Your decisions carry more weight. Your actions become more deliberate. Your focus becomes more refined. You are no longer chasing everything. You're discerning what aligns and what is not. You are learning to say no without guilt, to step back without fear, to move forward without needing constant reassurance. This is what it means to walk in purpose. It is not about doing more. It is about doing what matters with clarity and consistency. It is about understanding that your time, your energy, and your attention are valuable, and where you place them determines the direction of your life. And as you begin to operate from this place, you notice a shift not only in how you see things, but in how you are positioned within them. Opportunities begin to look different. Not necessarily more abundant, but more aligned. You become more selective, more aware of what truly fits your direction. You're less distracted by what looks appealing on the surface and more focused on what holds long-term value. And this shift protects you from misalignment, from stepping into spaces that may seem promising but are not meant for you. At the same time, the calling begins to reveal its impact. You start to see how your experiences, your growth, your perspective can influence others, not in a way that seeks validation, but in a way that naturally creates connection. People begin to resonate with your words, your actions, your presence, even when you're not trying to impress or convince. Because authenticity carries its own influence. It does not need to force its way in. It simply shows up, and those who are meant to receive it recognize it. This is where responsibility deepens. Because influence, even in its quiet form, requires awareness. It requires you to remain grounded, to remain disciplined, to remain consistent in your growth. It requires you to understand that what you carry is not just for you. It extends beyond you, into the lives of those who will encounter your journey in different ways. And that awareness can feel heavy at times, not as pressure, but as responsibility. A responsibility to stay aligned, to stay intentional, to continue growing even when you have already come so far. Because the moment you step into purpose is not the moment growth stops. It is the moment growth becomes even more important. There will still be challenges, moments of uncertainty, moments where things do not go as planned, moments where the path ahead is not completely clear. But those moments no longer shake you the same way, because you have already been through a process that required you to develop resilience, patience, and trust. And those qualities now support you in ways that are not always visible, but always present. You begin to rely less on immediate results and more on consistent direction. You understand that impact is not always instant, that progress is not always visible, that purpose is not always accompanied by recognition. And yet you continue, not because you have to, but because you're aligned with something that feels deeper than temporary outcomes. This is where your focus shifts from proving to serving. You are no longer trying to validate your worth or your abilities. You're simply expressing what has been developed within you. You're sharing what you have learned, applying what you have experienced, and allowing your actions to reflect your growth. And in doing so, you create space for others to see what is possible, not through perfection, but through authenticity and consistency. There's also a deeper level of trust that begins to form, not just in your path, but in your ability to walk it. You trust your decisions more. You trust your instincts more. You trust that even if you encounter obstacles, you have the capacity to navigate them. This trust does not come from external reassurance. It comes from having walked through uncertainty before and discovering that you were able to move through it. And as this trust builds, so does your confidence. Not a loud, attention-seeking confidence, but a quiet, steady assurance that you are where you are meant to be. That the steps you are taking, even if they are small, are moving you in the right direction. That the work you are doing, even if it is not widely seen, carries value and purpose. This is the beginning of living out your call.